The year 2025 feels disturbingly familiar. And if you listen closely, beneath the noise, beneath the headlines, beneath the surface of our global economy, you can hear the echo of a year that changed the world forever. 1941. Before we dive in, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? And if you care about deep, fact-driven history and want to support this channel's mission of bringing you the most accurate cinematic explanations of the past, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support allows this kind of high-effort research to continue down now. Let's begin. There are moments in history when the world shifts beneath people's feet long before they realize they're standing on a fault line. In 1941, millions across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas sensed tension, sensed anxiety, sensed the weight of uncertainty, yet almost none understood that the global economy had already crossed the point of no return. The currencies, the debts, the supply chains, the political bargains, and the slow unraveling of financial stability had set the stage for the most destructive conflict humanity has ever witnessed. Today, 2025, we stand in a strangely similar position. No, history does not repeat in the childish, literal sense, but it does rhyme, and more importantly, the economics that precede major shifts often follow the same patterns, even if the actors and technologies change. When we study 1941 through the lens of money, through inflation, gold reserves, bond markets, currency collapses, trade chokeholds, and resource scarcity, we begin to see parallels that are far too sharp to ignore. Before we go into the story, let me ask you something. Because your mind matters in this journey, do you believe that money tells the truth before governments do? Keep that question with you, because it is the central theme of this entire exploration. When politics lies, when leaders reassure, when newspapers distract, when populations try to hope their way out of crisis, money quietly exposes reality. That was true in 1941, and it is true today. Let's step back for a moment, not into the battlefield, but into the balance sheets that fueled it. In the late 1930s, the world was economically exhausted. The Great Depression had ripped through every major financial system on Earth. Industrial production had plummeted. Unemployment had soared to record levels. Gold reserves were bleeding. Governments were drowning in debt. And currencies faced devaluation after devaluation. The global economy was extremely fragile, and fragile systems break under stress. By 1941, most of the Western world was still operating under wartime or near-wartime economies, even if officially neutral. The United States had not yet entered the war militarily, but economically, it was already in deep. Roosevelt's administration was funneling resources, industrial capacity, and material support into Europe under the Lend-Lease Act. Britain was essentially bankrupt. Germany was living on financial illusions engineered by Jalmar, Schacht, and later by Gring's four-year plan. The Soviet Union was mobilizing its industrial base while pretending diplomacy was working. Japan faced total economic strangulation under American resource embargoes. All the signs were there. Economic cracks that signaled something catastrophic was coming. And here is the question. Are we ignoring similar cracks today? Think about this carefully. In 2025, we are witnessing a global economy strained by inflation cycles, supply chain vulnerabilities, rising energy dependencies, destabilized currency valuations, and geopolitical competition over resources. The world's superpowers are testing each other, not through direct confrontation, but through tariffs, sanctions, technology restrictions, rare earth mineral control, naval positioning, cyber operations, and financial warfare. This is not speculation. It is documented reality. But to understand whether the parallels with 1941 are meaningful, we must dive deeper. Let us return to the world of the early 1940s, not as tourists, but as economic archaeologists. Because to see the truth of today, we must excavate the lessons buried under the rubble of yesterday. Germany, by 1941, was running an economy that appeared strong on the surface. Low unemployment, rapid industrialization, rising production numbers, but beneath the facade, it was dangerously hollow. The Nazi state relied heavily on Mefo Bills, a pseudo-currency scheme that allowed Germany to secretly finance rearmament by issuing IOUs disguised as industrial payment instruments. These Mefo Bills bypassed budgetary scrutiny, hid debt from international observers, and made it seem like Germany had money it absolutely did not have. As a historian, I cannot stress enough, this was one of the most audacious acts of economic deception in modern history. The Reich had built a war machine without having the financial capacity to sustain it. Its entire model required expansion, territorial plunder, annexation of gold reserves, seizure of factories, forced labor, and extraction of resources from conquered territories. The German economy was not actually healthy, it was predatory, built on the assumption that war itself would solve its financial problems. When you compare this with 2025, consider this question carefully. How many nations today are depending on endless economic expansion to cover internal weaknesses? How many are relying on debt cycles, currency dilution, or artificially low interest rates to appear stronger than they are? How many are one geopolitical shock away from exposing their structural fragility? Stay with me, because the parallel gets sharper. Japan in 1941 faced a different but equally dangerous economic trap. Its industrial economy was almost entirely dependent on imported oil, iron, rubber, and other critical materials. When the United States imposed embargoes, Japan's leaders realized their economy had no future unless it secured these resources by force. This is not a justification, it is a factual explanation. In their internal documents, Japanese strategists estimated they had only 18 to 24 months of oil left. When you view Pearl Harbor through that lens, you see not a surprise attack, but a desperate economic gambit. Now look at 2025. Nations today depend heavily on globalized supply chains. But what happens when those chains are disrupted? When maritime routes face conflict? When energy markets fluctuate? When sanctions become a primary tool of geopolitical pressure? What happens when a nation's economic survival depends on a resource it cannot control? Let me ask you something directly. Do you think countries today act more rationally than countries in 1941? Or do we simply assume that modernity equals wisdom? If anything, the stakes are higher now, because economies are more interconnected, supply chains more fragile, and financial systems more leveraged. Let's turn the lens to the United States in both eras. In 1941, America was the world's industrial giant, producing nearly half of all global manufactured goods. It held the world's largest gold reserves. It had the world's most powerful industrial workforce. It had natural resources, geographic insulation, and expanding technological capacity. And yet, even then, the US struggled to stay out of global destabilization because the world's economy is not a collection of separate islands. It is a network. When one major node collapses, the system absorbs the shock. Today, the US is still enormously powerful, but its industrial dominance has shrunk. Its financial system is built not on gold reserves, but on digital debt, derivatives, and confidence. Its supply chains depend on foreign manufacturing. Its currency strength relies on global trust. And trust is an intangible resource hard to gain, easy to lose. This is where 2025 echoes 1941 in the eeriest possible way. The economic foundations of global power are shifting, and when economic foundations shift, geopolitical landscapes follow. In 1941, the world saw a rising power, Germany trying to reorder Europe, a rising power, Japan trying to reorder Asia, an existing power, Britain struggling to maintain order, a distant giant America trying to avoid conflict. A massive industrial state, the USSR, trying to prepare for what everyone knew was coming in 2025. We see a rising power challenging global economic order, an existing power strained internally, a continent struggling with energy and industrial competitiveness, regional powers asserting themselves, alliances being tested, economic blocks forming supply chains. Weaponized I want you to pause here and think. Are we seeing early-stage reconfigurations similar to the years before global conflict, not in terms of armies massing or declarations being made, but in terms of economic realignments that historically precede seismic events. Here's something people forget. World War II did not start in 1939, it started in the financial crises of the 1920s and 30s. The war was the effect, not the cause, and in 2025, if we want to understand the tensions of our world, we must look at the economics beneath the surface. Let me bring you deeper into the historical record. When Britain entered 1941, its gold reserves were nearly depleted. Its ability to pay for supplies relied on the goodwill and strategic interest of the United States. Lend-Lease was not charity. It was a calculated economic and geopolitical investment. The British pound never regained its global dominance after World War II. Because economic power, once lost, is difficult to recover. Think about that. A currency lost its global status, not because of bullets, but because of the economic strain that preceded them. Today, currency battles are quietly shaping our world again. Through sanctions, de-dollarization campaigns, digital currency experiments, and the shifting structure of trade agreements. History whispers, but money shouts. Now let's go back to the viewer, you. I want you to think about something very carefully as we move forward. If money was the indicator that foretold the disasters of 1941, what is today's money telling us? Are we paying attention to inflation cycles, debt levels, resource scarcity, trade, fragmentation, industrial decline, financial bubbles, currency realignments? This is not about predicting war. It is about understanding the signals that always appear before major historical turning points. Remember, nations don't break because armies march. Armies march because nations break. By 1941, every major player was economically cornered in some way. Their decisions, wise or foolish, were shaped by pressure, scarcity, and economic reality. And in 2025, our world is again defined by pressure. Economic pressure, resource pressure, currency pressure, debt pressure, population pressure, geopolitical pressure. You're going to notice something now. When historians compare eras, they never compare events, they compare conditions. And the conditions today look more like the early 1940s than most people are comfortable admitting. We will go much deeper into this in the continuation: how financial cracks led to geopolitical earthquakes, how currencies predicted conflict before politicians did, how economic desperation created alliances and invasions, and more importantly, what today's global money movements are signaling about the decade ahead. The world of 1941 was not built in a day. It was built slowly, silently, through a series of economic fractures that deepened year after year until the global order could no longer hold itself together. And here in 2025, when you strip away the modern technology, the smartphones, the satellites, the high-speed trading algorithms, you begin to see that the underlying financial pressures shaping our world are not new. They are old, very old. The patterns are ancient, the behaviors predictable, the consequences tragically familiar. Let's step back into the historical landscape, not as tourists, but as scholars who understand that money is the truest document of human intention. In 1941, nations were not simply preparing for war politically. They were being dragged into conflict by the gravitational pull of their own failing economic structures. Britain was running out of gold. Germany was running out of time. Japan was running out of oil. The Soviet Union was running out of options. And the United States was running out of excuses to remain neutral. The very architecture of global finance had become brittle. Every pressure point snapped at the same moment. That's how global conflict happens. Not because a single event starts it, but because the economic conditions make confrontation inevitable. Now imagine yourself standing inside the economic engine rooms of those nations. Scholarly analysis allows us to reconstruct the mindset of the time, and what we discover is chilling. German officials in 1941 knew that their currency would collapse if they slowed down territorial expansion. British officials knew their empire was financially unsustainable without American support. Japanese strategists calculated, to the decimal, that their industrial base would die without securing resource-rich territories. Soviet economists warned Stalin that industrial relocation to the east was the only way to survive a war they increasingly felt was unavoidable. And American policymakers debated whether the cost of staying out of conflict would be greater than the cost of entering it. These economic calculations were not emotional. They were brutally rational. So now we ask the historian's question: what does 2025 reveal when we analyze it with the same cold, economic logic? Let's begin with a simple but powerful concept: strategic scarcity. In 1941, scarcity of oil, steel, aluminum, rubber, grain, currency reserves, and ships shaped the actions of every major power. Today, the world faces different forms of scarcity. Energy transitions destabilizing old industries, semiconductor shortages reshaping geopolitics, rare earth minerals becoming bargaining chips, supply routes becoming choke points, and currencies experiencing vulnerability due to debt cycles. Scarcity forces nations to make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. And throughout history, economic scarcity is the single most reliable predictor of geopolitical conflict. Look again at Japan in 1941. It wasn't driven by ideology alone. It was driven by the cold reality that without oil, an industrial empire collapses. Japan had oil reserves for less than 2 years. Today, ask yourself, which nations are dependent on external resources for survival? Which nations cannot afford economic disruptions? Which nations are hoarding commodities? Which are stockpiling strategic reserves? Which are diversifying trade partnerships at unprecedented speed? These actions are economic, but their motivations are historical. In 1941, the world's trade arteries were collapsing. Globalization, which had peaked before World War I, had never fully recovered. By the late 1930s, countries were turning inward, raising tariffs, devaluing currencies, banning exports, hoarding critical goods. Sound familiar? Today, major economies are imposing semiconductor restrictions, technology bans, sanctions, export controls, and investment screenings. When global trade becomes a battlefield, history tells us that political confrontation is never far behind. Let's turn back to Germany, because few nations in history understood the fragility of their financial system better than the Third Reich. By 1941, Germany's economy depended on plunder at an industrial scale. Every conquered territory brought gold, foreign currency reserves, factories, oil fields, railways, and millions of forced laborers. Germany's leaders understood a principle as old as empires themselves. If your domestic economy cannot sustain your ambitions, you must expand or collapse. This is not ideology. This is economics. Now ask yourself the modern version of that question. Which countries today are expanding their influence through investments, acquisitions, strategic loans, infrastructure deals, or military presence? Which economies are stretched thin? Which ones depend on external growth to sustain internal stability? Which ones are one shock away from revealing structural weaknesses? History shows us that expansion, economic or territorial, is often not a sign of strength, but a sign of fragility. Now consider Britain in 1941. The empire still spanned the globe, yet its economic power had eroded. Maintaining such a vast empire required enormous spending. Currency reserves drained faster than they could be replenished. Lend-Lease allowed Britain to fight, but at the cost of surrendering global financial dominance. After the war, the pound sterling lost its central role in global finance. Its decline wasn't sudden. It began the moment Britain started fighting a war it could no longer afford. Ask yourself, which major currency today is showing early symptoms of overextension? Which nations rely on the global trust that money represents? What happens when that trust begins to weaken? The next piece of this historical puzzle is the Soviet Union. Contrary to popular belief, Stalin's USSR entered 1941 not as an unstoppable titan but as a fragile, rapidly industrializing giant trying desperately to catch up. Stalin moved entire industries eastward because he knew that industrial survival, not ideology, not manpower, would determine the outcome of any confrontation. The USSR did not win through numbers alone. It won through production. Industrial capacity wins wars. Economic resilience wins wars. Energy, steel, railways, and labor allocation win wars. So how does this translate to 2025? Nations today are racing for control over critical technologies. Energy independence, shipping lanes, data infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and resource production. Why? Because every major power understands, whether consciously or instinctively, that the next global contest will not be decided on the battlefield first, but in the factories, supply chains, and financial systems that support it. And now we arrive at one of the most important parallels between 1941 and 2025, the illusion of stability. In 1941, most ordinary people believed the world might still find peace. They assumed negotiations, diplomacy, and agreements would be enough. They assumed economies were strong enough to avoid total collapse. They assumed leaders would act rationally. They assumed things will work out. But beneath that optimism, economic forces were tearing at the foundations of global order. In 2025, we hear similar reassurances. The economy will stabilize, inflation is temporary, tensions will ease, supply chains will adjust, currencies will rebound. Yet the underlying structural issues remain unresolved. Global debt at historic highs, interest rate cycles unprecedented, countries hoarding strategic reserves, trade alliances shifting, currency blocks forming, and nations quietly preparing for contingencies. They refuse to discuss openly. Money is not emotional. Money is not political. Money does not lie. Money reveals truth before truth becomes unavoidable, and when money begins moving differently, when gold reserves shift, when currency swaps increase, when sanctions become routine, when militaries guard economic assets, when investments align with geopolitical fault lines, it tells historians exactly what stage of global tension the world is in. People ask, are we heading toward another global war? The historian's answer is never simple. Wars are not inevitable, but the conditions that precede them can be measured, analyzed, and understood. And many of today's conditions mirror those of the late 1930s and early 1940s with startling accuracy. Economic fragmentation, resource anxiety, currency realignment, trade weaponization, technological rivalry, debt stress, industrial rearmament, great power competition. But there is one crucial difference. The world of 2025 is more interconnected, more fragile, and more dependent on shared economic systems than in 1941. This means both danger and opportunity. A crisis today can spread faster than ever, but cooperation can also prevent collapse. If nations choose that path, this brings us to the central insight of this entire exploration. History does not teach us what will happen next. It teaches us what conditions lead to transformation. Economic stress shapes the decisions of nations. Those decisions shape geopolitics. And geopolitics shapes the fate of the world. If there is one thing to take away from the comparison between 2025 and 1941, it is this: ignoring the early warning signs is the most dangerous mistake a society can make. But unlike the people of 1941, we have hindsight, data, global communication, and historical understanding. We can see patterns earlier. We can analyze them more intelligently. We can understand the economic language that history speaks. So now I want to ask you directly, because your engagement shapes the value of this discussion. After hearing these parallels, do you think the world in 2025 is entering a period of transformation or a period of danger? Your answer matters. Your perspective matters. And the discussion we create together is part of understanding our world through the lens of history. If you want more deep professor-level analysis like this, precise, factual, cinematic, and relentlessly researched, then make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want the next topic to be about wartime inflation, gold reserves, hidden financing, or how nations secretly pay for war, Tell me in the comments. Thank you for watching. Stay curious. And stay aware, because history is not behind us. It is beneath us. And it is speaking again.